In this video, I'll be discussing the underpinning theories behind Bodyshop Revolution. Hi, John here again for Bodyshop Revolution. If you looked at my last video, you'll have been through some reasons why you might want to look at the Bodyshop Revolution process and techniques for building a better body shop and collision repair centre. Just a quick recap on my last video. We looked at some of the challenges you may have had, for example, not enough work, not enough profit, too long cycle times, problems with parts, problems with people, problem delivering vehicles on time. And if any of those resound with you, then I'm hoping you'll look at the next video, which is this one, which will start to look at the underpinning issues and theories behind the Bodyshop Revolution process. And this is really, really important because no process will work properly unless it has some real underpinning theories that are mathematical, scientific, and can be proven. It's no good just doing hearsay and all of the things that many body shop managers do around the application, around running the production process in their shops. So we're here to deliver some solutions, and I'm going to outline some of the reasons, some of the theories, and some of the value. Because body shops on the whole don't make very much money, then it's clear that there is a time for change and a need for change. And we've developed over the last 10 years theories that that can be put into practice that allow you to exponentially grow your body shop business. The reasons that those theories work is because they're well proven. They're proven in other areas of industry, and it's not just about what we do, it's about taking those proven methodologies and applying them to the body shop industry. So I guess the first question some of you will ask is, well, John, that's great, but how are you qualified to be able to do this? Well, let me just give you a 2-minute historical bit of background. I grew up in engineering, in Grand Prix race engineering, and then opened my first body shop in 1986. I ran that for 3 years, and I sold that because during that time we developed an estimating and management system called Bodymaster, which went on to sell 800 systems in the UK market. That business was sold in 1996, and I carried on with a company called Bikeback Systems, created by myself and my other partner, and we developed IT systems for the refinish industry and the collision repair industry. It was in about 2008 that we were looking at some of the methodologies that we're going to talk about in a minute, and I realized that body shops were really doing very much the same thing as they were doing when I was repairing cars back in the late 80s. Processes were the same. Yeah, we had some better technology. Yeah, we had kite mark and better standards, etc. in the UK market. But on the whole, repairers were doing the same things that they were always doing. And guess what? We're coming up with the same results. So myself and a couple of programmers who were working for me at the time started to sit down and say, well, hold on, that doesn't seem right. Is there anything that could be applied to the collision industry, for example, that is applied to other businesses that we see or might be able to be implemented in a way which gives greater value, which actually stops all of this juggling and firefighting and all of the difficulties and the chaos that occurs in collision shops. And of course everybody says, no, it's not possible because we don't know what's coming through the door. Every job we have is different. We don't know what's coming, and therefore it's impossible to predict, and therefore how are we ever going to get our cycle times down? How are we ever going to be able to schedule work into the system properly? And how are we going to be able to deliver them on time? So there's a lot of variables. It's difficult to do. It is difficult to do, and we set about deconstructing what body shops do and making no assumptions about what should be done, could be done. So in other words, we started from a completely blank piece of paper, completely blank in the fact that we didn't have preconceptions about what people did, we didn't have preconceptions about who they were, we didn't have preconceptions about the tasks they should perform, how those tasks should be performed, what order they should be done on, what technology we should use, how we schedule work into a body shop, how we sequence it, how we book it in, how we book it out, how we manage parts. Just clear the decks, absolutely clear the decks of all of that knowledge. That knowledge built up from experience working in the industry for 15 years at that time, and got to the point where we said, right, here's the blank sheet of paper. What methodologies do we stack into that blank piece of paper that allows us to start thinking with clarity, with science, with mathematics, into putting together a process whereby this sausage machine of a body shop can produce more vehicles, and not only produce more vehicles, but produce them with less chaos and more predictability. So we'd been doing a lot of studying into various things, and we'd come up with 3 key methodologies that we thought could be used, and one additional science that is on a different level, and that would be through behavioural sciences, because we know and understand that the body shop industry is a people industry. So we have to look at human behaviour in all of that. So the 3 methodologies that we started to look at and started to really study and started to understand and started to see how they could be practically applied to what we're thinking were these. The first one was lean thinking, and I'm sure many of you, and particularly in the US market, will have had quite a lot of exposure to lean thinking, and that was the first one. The second one was systems thinking, something some of you may not have heard of. I'll go on to explain a little bit about what that is and what that does and what it's all about. Systems thinking, and then finally theory of constraints. Theory of constraints, or constraint theory, is the third area, because we know for sure that body shops suffer from huge bottlenecks, areas where they back up and lines or queues appear. So theory of constraint was an obvious one. At the time, we didn't have a lot of knowledge about theory of constraint. Now we know quite a lot. So we then had to make sure that whatever we did, we had to make sure we could do empirical testing and use maths and science for making sure that everything we did was measurable, and that we actually could deliver a result and measure it and make sure that it actually performed as we expected, or to whatever we expected. So I'm now going to take you through the 4 key methodologies: lean, systems thinking, theory of constraints, and behavioural sciences, that contribute to creating what is called Bodyshop Revolution. So let's start off with lean thinking. A lot of you will have heard of this. Lean thinking was developed by Toyota in Japan through the Toyota production system, TPS. Toyota were unbelievable in the way in which they could produce product cheaper and quicker than any of their competitors, and a couple of guys called Womack and Jones decided they would study this and see what it was that was actually making these guys so good at what they did, and they coined the phrase lean thinking. And lean, in essence, and I'm not going to go into the detail in this video, there are further videos on the detail of lean, the detail of systems thinking, and the detail of theory of constraints. However, Womack and Jones, who coined the lean thinking phrase, recognized that they were really doing 2 key things. They were looking at the value stream. They're looking at the value, always coming from the value aspect to the customer. What they did, how did it add value? And anything that didn't add value was considered waste. And so alongside of the adding value, they also have this methodology of removing waste. So through 3 key waste areas, they applied standardization. In other words, making sure that everything was standard and documented correctly. They removed wastefulness in the system, so anything that was considered waste was taken out, and they applied uniformity. So many of you will see uniformity if you studied lean as things like 5S. So 5S would be a good example of where uniformity is applied in a production system. What is important to understand is that lean is applied in general to linear production systems or serial production systems. Production systems where you'll find that products go along in a line and they sequentially move forward. You probably would look at a body shop and say, do you know what? That's what happens in my body shop. You know, I take things from my strip department, tear down in America. I put them into my panel or metal. I put them then into my paint preparation, then to my paint, then to my buff polish area, back to refitting of parts. So you'd think that that was a linear system, and it is. But that linear system itself bites us in the backside, and I'll explain all of that later. So this linear production system that Lean studied, adopted, and provided results around is all well and good if you're producing widgets or you're producing cars, but it's a real challenge to apply that to the body shop. Real challenge to apply it to a body shop. But later on we'll discuss how methodologies like tact, tact from the original German word meaning time lapse, it is an example of how we could look and how many people do apply lean thinking into collision repair. So if you want to know a bit more about, or a lot more about lean thinking, I can recommend a very, very good book, and it's called Lean Thinking by Womack and Jones, and you'll find down below in this video links on Amazon to all of the books that I'm going to talk about. So if you want to do any further study, you want to understand a bit more, you want to understand those really deep underlying principles behind what we're talking about, you can go away and study it. There are millions and millions of books on lean thinking. I suggest you don't get too heavily into that, but it's a fascinating subject. So let's just move on now to the next methodology. Now, the next methodology we looked at was systems thinking. Now, systems thinking is about the interrelated and interdependent parts of any system. So what is a system? Well, you could take a car as a system. It is a thing, a system that is made up of parts, and all those parts are interconnected and they all have a relationship to each other. You could, for example, take a school as a system, because the school, although of course it's around human behaviours and teaching, still is a system. And that again has components, and all those components are interrelated. All systems have boundaries. So there's always something around the outside. Now those boundaries can be flexible, those boundaries can be very solid, and it just depends on what that system is all about. So not only do we have boundaries and elements, but we also have feedback loops in systems, because systems like to find their own natural sort of balance. And in order, when we change something in a system, what happens is that as we make a change, it alters other bits of the system. And making these small changes in the system often can upset other parts of the system. So if, for example, you consider obviously a body shop as a system, then if you make a change in the paint preparation area, that may have a knock-on effect to the paint area, and it may have an upstream effect on metal panel or whatever. So clearly a system is quite a complex thing, and if you mess about with it, it behaves in odd ways. And I know you all know that when you mess about with your body shop system, it behaves in very odd ways, and then it settles down again. So systems thinking is absolutely critical to the application of new processes, different ways of doing work in the collision repair industry. What we have to do with systems thinking, or what systems thinking is about, is very much a bottom-up approach, very much making the people in the organisation that are doing the work, and I mean doing the real hard labour, the difficult work, get them to work bottom up. And we'll talk a lot about bottom up thinking. And you also need to, of course, create a framework. Within your system, it must have a framework, a method of doing things. If you, for example, take a lot of American shops where they have a standard operating procedure, that to some extent is a framework. It may be rigid, it may be quite flexible, but it's a framework, and that's something that can then be operated within. Remember, systems thinking is also very people-centric. It's very much about how people behave and what they do within that system. Change the behaviours, change the tasks within the system, and things will get lopsided, things will fall over, things may not go as you expected. And I'm sure you've all had plenty of experience of changing something and tweaking something in your body shop system, and it's really gone a little bit belly up. And so you have to rewrite the ship and get it back on track. The third methodology that we looked at and apply is something called theory of constraints, TOC. So if you hear me referring to the acronym TOC, it means theory of constraints. That is the theory or the study of constraints, bottlenecks. It shows that any system is limited by a small number of constraints. So your body shop as a system is limited by bottlenecks, and it's understanding the effect of those bottlenecks on the output of the system. It's understanding the effects of those bottlenecks on the behaviour of the system. None of these things are easy, and they're all malleable, and they're all flexible, and so it becomes quite difficult. Now, within theory of constraints, there's quite a lot of methodology. It was developed from some work done in World War II, and then properly taken into mainstream by a guy called Goldratt, who's a scientist from Israel. Unfortunately, died a few years ago now, and he's really made a real philosophy out of theory of constraint. And he, for example, developed what are called the 5 focusing steps of theory of constraints: the ability to identify constraints, the ability to do something about them when you found them, the ability to make sure that once you've found them that you can actually get work into them without it stopping, and also the ability then, once you've done that, to be able to go and review where your constraints are at this current period of time, and then this sort of loop continues on through the 5 focusing steps. Theory of constraint also deals with something called drum, buffer, rope, DBR. So drum would be considered the drum beat of your business. It's about the flow rate of what occurs during the business. So if you think of it as a car production line, that would be the number of cars that come out every minute out through the production line. In a body shop, it's very much about getting the throughput and understanding what it is that is creating the drum beat within the business. In other words, the slowest part of the business. Yeah. We then have buffers within DBR, so drum, buffer, rope. The buffer is effectively, think of it as a queue or a line in front of the constraint. In other words, and I will go into this in much more detail in a further video, but it is the queue we need in front of a constraint, the slowest part of your system, in order to make sure that we don't starve it, and in order to make sure that everything in the business is subordinated to the constraint. So that's why we have buffers. We also will tack a buffer behind the primary constraint as well to stop it blocking up. And then thirdly, the rope part of it is very much about the thing called pull. Most body shops that we see push. Most body shops push work into the door. And what happens then, of course, is you increase WIP. And rather than pushing, because the pressure is on always from customers that get more cars in, rather than pushing, we want to make sure that we can pull. And it's absolutely critical that we work a way out of pulling work through. And if you think about it metaphorically, if you were to tie a rope onto the front bumper of a vehicle and then just slowly pull it towards you, that would be the method by which you'd be thinking about how you get cars through the body shop. Pulling cars out rather than pushing cars in. And again, we'll cover this in real detail later on in this in the video series. So definitely theory of constraint has some real value. Another term you'll hear talking about in theory of constraint are Murphy's. Murphy is a real odd one. Murphy is Murphy's law. And Murphy's law says that if it can happen, it will happen, and always at the wrong possible time. So Murphy can strike and things can go wrong. And so Murphy is an integral part of theory of constraint. And you know as well as I do that Murphy's strike you every day. Murphy's in parts not here, estimate done incorrectly, somebody's dropped a headlamp, all that sort of stuff. Compressor breaks down. Those are all what we might call Murphy's. Theory of constraint also has something called POOGI, process of ongoing improvement. And that is a way in which we will continually look at what we're doing, continually look at whether we can improve what we're doing, and try and prove ourselves wrong. We always try and prove ourselves wrong. We always try and put ourselves out of business before our competitors do. But POOGI is something that is integral within theory of constraint. Another element of theory of constraint that we have utilised significantly is something called critical chain project management. And critical chain project management is a method of making sure that all of the elements that make up the repair or whatever you're doing can be conceived as part of a project. And that project has an end. And that end is the handover of the key back to the customer. So it's really, really important to make sure that all those elements come together and arrive at the right time so that the car can be handed back to the customer. Any one of those elements that fails to get to where it should be at the right time is going to screw up your opportunity for delivery. So critical chain project management is again a significant part of understanding how to repair cars and repair cars successfully. And something that we've done, luckily you won't have to because it's a really, really complicated subject, is something called the thinking process. Again, it's an element within theory of constraint. So the thinking process is a way in which you think about the application of TOC from a practical perspective into a business or into a solution. And that's always the problem with these theories, is the application into practice. So thinking process includes things like reality trees, current reality tree, future reality tree, where you map out where things are and where things will go. And it also includes things like evaporating clouds. All sounds a bit woo-woo, but evaporating clouds are a very, very clever way of solving what seem sometimes insurmountable problems. So once you get your head around evaporating cloud, it allows you to work out problems that you think, well, nobody's doing this right, nobody seems to have a solution, let's put it into the evaporating cloud and we can work out how to do that. And there were many, many times over the last 10 years that we've applied evaporating cloud thinking to solve solutions that just seem unsolvable. So again, it's a really important part of theory of constraint. As I say, luckily you don't really have to touch it, but if you want to read up about it, yeah, there are plenty of great books. Again, links below. If you want to study theory of constraints and just understand it at a basic level, I would really suggest that you read The Goal. The Goal is a book by Ellie Goldratt, and I've put a link down below. Ellie has written quite a few books, and the first few were written in novel style. Now, I'm not a lover, a fan of them. I'd rather have been written as a textbook or a scientific book, but it was actually written as a novel. The great thing about it is it actually, and you don't realise it before you read it, it actually gets your head into the thinking process. Yeah, so once you can do that, you can then work, yeah, with Alex, the character in it, and understand how the application of theory of constraint can be achieved using the thinking process. So well worth a read. And if you like that book, you can go on to look at others. He has one called Critical Chain, another one called It's Not Luck, another one called Isn't It Obvious, and another one called Necessary but Not Sufficient. That'll keep you reading to the late night hours for some months, I would imagine. Again, if you're a nerd and you want to understand theory of constraints and you really want to understand it, then I would suggest you look at those books and take it on board. The great news is you don't have to, because we've done that already for you, and we've applied all of that thinking process into application practically of how body shops work. Now, all of those methodologies I've talked about can be measured. All of the things that we do and use, lean, systems thinking and theory of constraints, can actually be measured using maths or with feedback loops, or you can look at reason, and so they are absolutely ideal for implementing to the body shop and to make the change and put the changes in and see what the differences are. It's not always easy, but it is possible and practical, and you can get some numbers from that, and that's really, really important. Now, the fourth component of Bodyshop Revolution is the bit that you can't really measure. It's extremely difficult, and that is around social science and psychology, or the behavioural sciences. You see, the way in which people behave in your shop directly influences the output, directly influences the culture, and directly influences the way in which you work. I'm sure many of you have a prima donna somewhere in the business. Yeah, somebody that's got a very, very, very big personality that knows how everything's done, has such strong belief systems about how body shops work, and is self-centric, and everything works around him, and it doesn't really matter about everything else. Those are typical situations that occur through human behavior. So there are two aspects we have to look at. One is social science, and social science is the study of the way in which people behave culturally, the way in which they communicate, the way in which they interact, the way in which they have levels and hierarchies, and how that all plays out in your business. And you know this very well. Handling the people bit is extremely difficult. So social science is a really, really important part to that. And then when you come to the finer detail, you have to go into psychology itself. And psychology is actually the behavior of the mind, and it's a study of feelings and thought. And it deals with the conscious and the unconscious, because we all have belief systems, and those belief systems may be political, they may be religious, they may be belief in how I put a bicycle tire on, or belief on how I repair cars, or belief in whether I use this sanding paper or this paint's better. They're all belief systems. Most of them are unfounded. Most of them are not really founded on anything concrete. They're just belief systems. So you can take that to the nth extent, but those belief systems are the things that are holding you and the people within your organization back from making the changes. So my job here is to knock down some of those belief systems, or prove that some of those belief systems are not actually valid. They're not actually valid beliefs. They're not beliefs that can be substantiated and proven out to actually add value to what you're doing. And when you apply the belief within a holistic systems thinking application, you start to see that people's beliefs completely mess and screw up what you're trying to achieve at a localized silo-based level in order to provide whatever that person may wish, whatever goal that person has specifically to him, not necessarily to you or to the overall, the system. So again, culture and belief systems are all some things that need to be tackled. And believe me, these are not something that you knock down in 5 minutes. These are not something that you deal with in 5 minutes. They take time, and you have to learn about it, and you have to understand how you implement that, and how you talk to people, and how you encourage people, how they behave, how they're measured, how they behave when they're measured. All of that is absolutely critical to what we're doing. And if we then apply all of this stuff and we study what has occurred, we'll see some fascinating changes. So we did some studies into time and motion about 10 years ago in 2 or 3 body shops, because we were interested to understand actually how productive are body shops. And shops give us measurements in efficiency and productivity and utilization, etc. But they don't always tell the story. You've actually got to time lapse or watch people working to understand the behaviours and actually what happens. In all of our observations, we noticed that no body shop achieved more than 60% of their time actually working. The other 40% was doing stuff that added no value to the workday and no value to the throughput or output of the business. So time and motion studies to try and understand where body shops were was really critical, because we need to know, were we able or are we able to actually get more value out of it before we go and apply all these sciences and behavioural stuff. If there was no fat left on the bone to get rid of, we'd be wasting our time. We recognise there's at least 40% minimum, 40% minimum that can be just sucked out of the system by just changing the system a little bit to make sure that that's what's happening. And the thing is, you see, that people are your business. It is a people business. It's not a car business. You're selling time. Every hour you sell is created by people, and the people are your time. So it's absolutely essential that the people, the team within the organisation are all aligned and understand the vision and understand what the objectives, and get buy-in and feel part of the organisation in moving forward. We'll be talking a lot about that in the future. So just to sum up again, 4 methodologies that we're putting in Bodyshop Revolution, or we're using as effectively the baseline, the backbone, the underpinning theories by which we work, which we have to have. They're not John's ideas. They're fully established, scientifically based ideas around some lean principles, not all, some lean principles, and I will explain that in a future video, why lean doesn't really work in body shops. You can get an improvement with lean, but it doesn't really work. You're really going down the wrong path when you go lean, but we can talk about that later. So lean thinking, and particularly around things like 5S, which is just obvious stuff to do, and we'll cover 5S in detail. 5S, systems thinking, about how we view holistically the whole shop, the whole system, and when we make changes here and there, those changes don't upset the system. In other words, all of the changes that we make are made in alignment and with a view of the system's output, not an individual departmental output. So absolutely critical we don't look at the detail before we look at it holistically. All we're interested in, if you think about it, is getting more work out of the door. We don't really care what happens inside. We do, but we don't really care what happens inside. We don't care whether some bits may be slower or faster if the overall result is getting more work out of the door. So systems thinking, holistically thinking, is critical to successful collision repair. And then on that layer, we apply theory of constraint. And theory of constraint comes in with a bit more of the mechanics of it. So the mechanics of it are, what are your constraints? Where are your bottlenecks? How do we deal with them? How do we get the bottlenecks unblocked? What do we have to do to unblock them? What do we have to do upstream to make sure that we can always supply work to those bottlenecks? What is the effect of the bottleneck in the business? How does that affect my output? What does that do to flow? All of those are questions that are absolutely critical when we start talking about theory of constraint. And then we apply in things like POOGI. We talked about the process of ongoing improvement to make sure we carry on getting better and better at it. We also talk about DBR, drum buffer rope, whereby we've got the heartbeat of the business absolutely nailed. We know what our output should be and we keep it at that output, and we also know that we can buffer things to make sure we've got the relevant little cues in front of things, the little lines in front of things, to make sure that we're getting work out of the door. And finally, we have the rope bit where we're pulling the work through rather than pushing it in. Yeah, so that's again an absolutely critical change. So the final bit, of course, is the behavioural stuff about how people think, how their minds work, how they deal in cultures, how peer pressure works, and all that stuff we'll tackle. But it's absolutely critical and a really, really important part to making sure that the implementation of Bodyshop Revolution for you is smooth, and that people are on board with it and want to make it work rather than want to make it fail. Yeah, you don't want to even go down that road if people want to make it fail. So those are the four things. In the next video, we're going to deal particularly in the detail around theory of constraint and systems thinking. We're going to start to look at the practical application. Well, not so much the practical application, but the theory behind the practical application, if that makes sense. In other words, if we did this because theory of constraint said so, what would be the practical application? Because the application itself is extremely difficult to do, going from the theory to actually what the SOP says, what the standard operating procedure says. It's so easy to say, oh, we've got these all airy-fairy theories, John, but how do we get them into practice? Well, that's what we'll be covering a lot in future videos, but I just wanted to talk to you about how we use these three theories, methodologies, yeah, TOC, lean, and systems thinking, and behavioural sciences on top of that to get a result. That's absolutely critical. So once we've tackled the theory of constraint and systems thinking in the next video, we'll actually get a better understanding then of how we would design a shop or redesign a shop to meet the needs or meet the value of what we're trying to do. So my challenge then is to help you to be able to apply practically how you would get this theory into an SOP to then get it practically into a shop. So there's loads and loads of exciting stuff coming up. I haven't even touched on things like parts, and I haven't touched on things like IT, and I haven't touched on things like how we pay people, but we will. I haven't touched on things like the way in which we would schedule work into a shop, how we would actually get a predictable workflow system, how we would achieve continuous workflow. I haven't even touched that yet. There's so much good stuff to come, and I hope you'll stick with me and you know, share your information, because we never ever stop learning. So there's great stuff coming up. That's it for today in this video. If you can, click the like button below. That means that all of the videos in here go higher up the YouTube rankings and more people will see it, and we'll get more body shops on board, and we'll get more successful body shops in business. Finally, just remember, try and view these videos in sequence, because you've probably noticed today I've touched quite a lot of things. If you miss this one out, we go straight into theory of constraints. You go, woo, what's all that about? So just make sure they're all numbered. This one's number 2, that you go through them in sequence, and you get the full benefit from them. And you may find it's worth just replaying it to really understand what's going on. Not so much for this one, because we haven't dealt with any technical stuff, but once we get into the technical stuff, you want to replay it to actually go, right, yeah, right, I get it. Because I've got to help you to learn about how to understand the theory. If you don't understand the theory, when things go wrong for you, you won't know how to put it right. But once you understand the theory, which isn't complicated, it depends how deep you go, but it isn't complicated. In fact, most of it is common sense. But when we apply those theories, and you understand those theories, when you then actually apply in practice what you're doing, you'll find that it's much, much easier. And when things go wrong, which they will, when things go wrong, you'll be able to go, I know what to do with this. We know what to look for. We know what are the key markers. We know what things will show us that, it's good, it's bad, or what should be happening, etc. We can do that. So remember, click the like. Yeah. Remember, view them in sequence. That's it for now, and I'll see you next time.